Have you ever woken up at 3 in the morning for no apparent reason? Heart racing, the room completely silent, a strange feeling that something, or someone, is present, but you can't see it. What if I told you that this exact moment, this awakening that seems random, has absolutely nothing accidental about it? What if I told you that Jesus spoke directly about this, that the biblical records themselves point to this hour with a precision that most churches have simply never opened their mouths to explain? This is not another video about spiritual dreams, vague religious symbolism, or poetic interpretations of the Bible. What you are about to hear here is different. It is a layer of spirituality that has been kept on the margins of Sunday sermons, pushed aside from common preaching, buried beneath centuries of institutional silence. And there is a very specific reason for that silence. You will understand everything by the end. Think with me for a moment. Why exactly 3 in the morning? Of the 24 hours in a day, why does this particular hour appear so frequently in accounts of intense spiritual experiences, visions, supernatural encounters, answered prayers, and also in the moments of greatest spiritual oppression that human beings have ever endured? It is not a coincidence. It never was. And the answer is hidden in plain sight, right in front of everyone, in texts that billions of people have read, and yet still failed to see what is really written there. There is a detail that almost no one notices. A detail that connects the nightly watch, Jesus' teachings on prayer, the patterns of the spiritual world, and the invisible battle that takes place in exactly that window of time. A detail that, once you see it clearly, will permanently change the way you experience your late nights, your spirituality, and your relationship with the sacred. This video is not theory. It is not speculation. It is research. It is biblical text. It is history. It is applied spirituality. And I promise that if you stay with me until the end, you will walk away with an understanding that most people will carry to their graves without ever having reached. Why has the church never explained this directly? What is it about waking at 3 in the morning that goes beyond the biological, the psychological, and touches something that science still cannot fully name? What is the real connection between this hour, the teachings of Jesus, and what we call the spiritual world? You are about to find out. And I need you to stay here because the revelations ahead build on one another. If you leave before the end, you will miss the very part that matters most to your life right now. Some people arrive at this video by chance, but you already know, deep down, that there is no such thing as chance when the subject is spirituality. Something brought you here, and what comes next will show you exactly why. For centuries, the 3 o'clock hour has been treated as taboo, as a boundary, as a threshold between two worlds. Not only in Christian traditions, but in cultures that never had any contact with one another. That alone should raise an enormous question in you. And I am going to answer that question now, starting with what very few people know about what Jesus actually said and did at this hour. Because the answer will surprise you, and it begins one night on a beach on a stormy sea, with Jesus walking on the water at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. Stay with me. What comes next changes everything. Have you ever had that feeling of waking in the middle of the night and realizing it is exactly 3 o'clock, or a few minutes past, as if something invisible had tapped you on the shoulder? Millions of people around the world report this. And for decades, the standard response has always been the same. It is biological, it is stress, it is the sleep cycle. But what if that answer, as comfortable as it may seem, is incomplete? What if there is a dimension to this phenomenon that modern science simply does not have the language to describe, but which ancient spiritual traditions have mapped with remarkable precision? This video exists to open that layer, to show you what the sacred texts say, what history has recorded, and what Jesus revealed about this specific hour, this watch hour, this late-night threshold that many call the hour of darkness and others call the hour of divine visitation. You will learn here what it means spiritually to wake at 3 in the morning, why this hour appears repeatedly in biblical records, what ancient traditions said about this window of time, and how you can transform this awakening into a moment of deep connection with the sacred, rather than a moment of fear or confusion. If you have ever felt that there is something no one tells you about spiritual life, go ahead and hit the like button right now. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, subscribe here, because what is coming in the next videos is directly connected to what you will hear today. And comment the word Vigil down below if you have ever woken at 3 in the morning and felt it was not for nothing. I want to know how many people on this channel have lived that. If what you are hearing right now has already shifted something inside you, imagine what is in the digital book I left in the first pinned comment. It is not a summary of what you will see here. It is what does not fit in a video. Go access it now. It could come down at any moment. To understand why waking at 3 in the morning carries such specific weight within biblical spirituality, you first need to understand how time was divided in the ancient world. And this is not a minor historical detail, it is the key to everything that follows. In the time of Jesus, the Romans divided the night into 4 watches. Each watch corresponded to a period of approximately 3 hours. The first watch ran from sunset until around 9 o'clock at night. The second watch ran from 9 until midnight. The third watch ran from midnight until 3 in the morning, and the fourth watch ran from 3 until dawn. This system was not merely military or organizational. It penetrated deeply into the spiritual language of the era, and Jesus used exactly that language when speaking about watchfulness, prayer, and the return of the Lord. Now pay close attention to this. When the Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 14, describes Jesus walking on the sea toward his disciples, the text is specific. It says that Jesus came to them in the 4th watch of the night. The 4th watch. From 3 to 6 in the morning. This is not a calendrical detail. It is a spiritual declaration. The moment when the disciples were most exhausted, most afraid, most vulnerable, furthest from any sense of control, that was the exact moment Jesus chose to manifest himself. To appear. To walk on the surface of the impossible. This pattern is not isolated. It repeats in striking fashion throughout the sacred texts. In the book of Job, the most intense spiritual visits occur in the depths of the night. In Acts of the Apostles, Paul and Silas receive supernatural deliverance in the middle of the night. The Jewish tradition at the time of Jesus had a very precise understanding of the nighttime hours as periods of spiritual intensity, hours in which the veil between the visible world and the invisible one was thinner. But why 3 in the morning specifically? What is it about this hour that sets it apart from the others? The answer involves something most people have never heard in any sermon, any preaching, any Sunday school class. There exists in Jewish tradition and in the earliest Christian writings an understanding that midnight divides the night in half, but that 3 in the morning represents a different kind of transition point. It is the moment when the night has already passed its densest point and begins, imperceptibly, to give way to a light that has not yet arrived. It is the threshold. It is the frontier between the deepest darkness and the first hint of dawn. In spiritual terms, this threshold has been described by different traditions as a moment when spiritual forces, both those that oppress and those that liberate, are at peak activity. It is no coincidence that exorcists throughout history report that the most intense manifestations occur in this interval. And it is no coincidence that saints and contemplatives from different eras describe visions, callings, and revelations arriving at precisely these hours. Modern science has a partial explanation for this. Research on circadian rhythm shows that the human body reaches its minimum temperature between 3 and 4 in the morning. The immune system, hormones, and brain activity are in a completely different configuration at this hour. REM sleep, the phase in which dreams are most vivid and emotional processing is most intense, tends to concentrate in the final hours before dawn. In other words, human biology is literally more porous, more open, more receptive at this point in the night. But here is what science cannot answer. Why did cultures all over the world, with no contact with one another, arrive at the same spiritual conclusion about this hour? The indigenous peoples of the Americas, the Hindu traditions of India with the concept of Brahma Muhurta, the sacred hour before dawn, the Christian monastic orders with the practice of matins, Judaism with the midnight vigil known as Tikkun Chatzah, all of them, independently of one another, pointed to the same window of time as sacred, as special, as a threshold between worlds. This cannot be explained by biology alone. There is something more, and the teachings of Jesus must be read within this context for their true depth to appear. Because when Jesus tells his disciples watch and pray, he is not giving generic advice about devotion. He is speaking of a specific practice, embedded in a specific understanding of spiritual time, with specific consequences for those who practice it and for those who ignore it. And there is a detail in that instruction that almost no one notices, a detail that is right there in the text, visible to anyone who reads it. But that goes unnoticed because without the right context it seems like just another encouraging phrase. That detail is what connects everything you are hearing now to your life in a way that will become very clear in the next few minutes. If this message has strengthened your faith, brought peace to your heart, or helped you in any way, know that you can also help us continue to spread content like this. Producing these messages requires time, dedication, and a great deal of work to bring words of hope to more and more people. If you feel in your heart a desire to support this mission, I left a link in the first pinned comment. Any contribution, regardless of the amount, helps us continue this work and reach lives around the world. May God multiply twofold everything you sow in love. Now that you understand the historical and spiritual context of nighttime watches, it is time to go deep into what might be called the central revelation, the one that most people who grow up within Christianity never hear framed this way, yet which is written in the Gospels with remarkable clarity for those who have eyes trained to see it. There is one specific night in the Gospels that is practically a map of what happens in the spiritual world when a human being is in the depths of the night. That night is Gethsemane. And most people who know this story read it as an account of Jesus' anguish before the crucifixion. That is true, but it is only the surface layer. The deeper layer reveals something about the dynamic between the visible world and the invisible one, between flesh and spirit, between sleep and wakefulness, that completely transforms the way you understand what happens when you wake at 3 in the morning. Let us go to the text. Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane with his disciples. The hour, according to the narrative context, is exactly the 3rd or 4th watch of the night, the deep night watch. He withdraws and begins to pray. And then he does something extraordinary. He returns to the disciples and finds them asleep. Not once. 3 times. 3 times Jesus returns. 3 times he finds the disciples surrendered to sleep. And 3 times he speaks variations of the same question. Could you not watch with me for even 1 hour? This number 3 is not literary accident. In the biblical tradition, 3 is the number of divine completeness, of manifestation, of confirmation. And Jesus' question is not a complaint born of weariness. It is an instruction disguised as a question. He is saying, something is happening in this space of time, in this specific hour of the night, that requires your conscious presence. And you are missing it. But what is happening in Gethsemane at that moment? The text of Luke adds a detail that the other evangelists leave out. He says that an angel appeared to Jesus and strengthened him. A spiritual being manifested, visible, active, in the deep night, in the hour of the watch, at the exact moment when the spiritual weight of the world was at its peak. The disciples missed this vision because they were asleep, literally and metaphorically, and Jesus had tried 3 times to wake them so they could participate in what was happening. This casts a completely new light on what it might mean to wake at 3 in the morning. And here is the perspective you will rarely hear from any pulpit. What if this awakening is not disruption, but summons? What if the fact that you open your eyes at this hour, without an alarm, without any apparent reason, is exactly the modern equivalent of what Jesus tried to do with the disciples in Gethsemane, to wake you for a moment when the spiritual world is in full activity and you have the opportunity to consciously participate in it? The Christian mystical tradition has a name for this. It is called the grace of the vigil. And the great contemplatives, from John of the Cross to Teresa of Avila, from Ignatius of Loyola to the monks of the Egyptian desert, all describe this spontaneous awakening in the night not as a problem to be solved with a sleeping pill, but as an opening, a window, a call that most people, for lack of knowledge, simply close and return to sleep without understanding what they missed. Now think about your own experience. Have you ever woken at this hour and felt a heaviness in your heart, a desire to pray, a sense that something needed spiritual attention? Many people describe exactly that, an inner compulsion that has no name, that did not come from outside, that arose from within, and that is usually ignored because no one ever taught them what to do with it. Psalm 119, verse 162, says, "At midnight I rise to give you thanks." The psalmist is not describing a routine of forced religious discipline. He is describing a state of spiritual sensitivity so acute that the very act of waking in the middle of the night is felt as a call to praise. This state is not exclusive to saints and mystics. It is available to anyone who understands what is happening when the night reaches its deepest point. And there is more. There is an element in this revelation that will surprise you because it connects the biblical text with something that happens in the spiritual world in a very specific way at this hour. An element that explains both the moments of deep spiritual peace in the early morning and the moments of oppression, fear, and a sense of negative presence that also occur in this same interval. And that shows why your posture, awake and conscious versus asleep and unconscious, makes all the difference. Some people watch, enjoy, and move on. Some want to go deeper. If you are the second type, the digital book is in the first pinned comment. Click now. What you just heard about Gethsemane and the nightly watch is already enough to transform the way you see your late nights. But there is an even deeper layer that most people never reach because they never ask the right question. The right question is not, why do I wake at 3 in the morning? The right question is, what is happening in the spiritual world at this hour that makes my consciousness relevant? And the answer to that question completely shatters some of the most established beliefs about how spirituality works in daily life. Let us start with a fact that surprises many people the first time they hear it. The expression "the hour of darkness" has a specific origin in the Gospels, and it does not refer to what most people imagine. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verse 53, Jesus says to the soldiers who come to arrest him in Gethsemane, "This is your hour, and the power of darkness." This phrase is spoken precisely in the night watch, in the early morning hours, and Jesus is making a declaration about the nature of spiritual time. There are hours when certain forces have greater freedom to act. There are moments when the power of darkness operates with greater intensity. And there are moments when the power of light also operates with greater intensity. This is not superstition. It is not folklore. It is in the Gospels. And it has direct implications for what happens when you wake at 3 in the morning. The patristic Christian tradition, the writings of the first theologians and church leaders of the early centuries, developed a very sophisticated understanding of spiritual time. Origen of Alexandria, writing in the 3rd century, described the night as a period of heightened spiritual activity, both for forces that oppress and for the grace that sets free. He based this on a careful reading of the Gospels and of Paul's letters, especially the famous passage in Ephesians 6 where Paul describes the spiritual armor as necessary for the fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. What Origen and the other church fathers understood, and which was gradually lost from popular preaching, is that this struggle has a temporal dimension. It is not equally intense at every moment. There are peaks. And the early morning hours are one of those peaks. Now comes the element that connects all of this with modern science in a way that will make you think. Researchers in neuroscience and sleep studies have found that between 3 and 5 in the morning, the human brain is in a unique configuration. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought and emotional regulation, shows reduced activity. The amygdalae, responsible for deep emotional processing and for fear and intuition responses, are in a state of heightened sensitivity. In practical terms, this means that at this hour you are biologically more connected to your deep emotions, more permeable to intuitions, more vulnerable to fears, and, at the same time, more open to experiences that transcend the rational. Spirituality calls this the threshold. Neuroscience calls it an extended hypnagogic state. Both are describing the same reality with different languages. And what this means for you is that when you wake at 3 in the morning, you are not simply awake, you are in a state of consciousness that is literally different from your daytime state. You are at the frontier. And here is where the most common belief breaks down. Most people who wake at this hour and feel fear, oppression, anxiety, or a negative presence assume they are being spiritually attacked. That may be. But it may also be that you are simply more permeable to what has always been there, and that the heightened perception of this hour is revealing something that your daytime state used to filter out. It is not necessarily that something worse is happening. It is that you are momentarily, with the veil thinner. And that is exactly what Jesus wanted the disciples to understand in Gethsemane. He did not want them to sleep because sleep closes that veil, shuts down that perception, and would have kept them oblivious to what was happening both at the spiritual and the historical level. Conscious watchfulness in that moment would have allowed them to participate, to pray, to remain present in one of the most spiritually charged hours in human history. Have you ever experienced something like this? A moment in which you woke in the middle of the night with an inner certainty about something, a concern for someone, a feeling that you needed to pray for a specific person, a clarity about a difficult decision, and the next day discovered there was a concrete reason for that feeling. That is not superstition. It is not psychosis. It is the functioning of what the tradition calls spiritual discernment operating through the natural permeability of this hour. The early church knew this. The monastic orders built an entire spirituality around it. The Desert Fathers, those first Christian monks who lived in Egypt and Syria between the 3rd and 5th centuries, practiced what they called agrypnia, the sacred vigil of the early morning. They described this hour as the one in which the heart speaks louder than the mind, and in which the presence of God is felt with less effort because the layers of the day have been removed. What if they were right? What if your waking at 3 in the morning is not a physiological problem to be corrected, but a spiritual practice to be learned? Write the word T-threshold here below if you have ever woken at this hour and felt you were on the edge of something greater than you could understand. Because I believe that many people watching this video at this very moment have already lived that. And the next section will show you why this awakening has a pattern and what you can do with it that will completely change your spiritual life. Stay with me because what comes now is the most practical and most powerful part of everything you will hear today. Throughout the centuries, researchers, theologians, and historians have accumulated an impressive body of evidence pointing in the same direction. Waking at 3 in the morning is not an isolated, culturally specific, or religiously conditioned phenomenon. It is universal. And that universality alone is already proof that we are facing something that transcends any simplistic explanation. Let us look at the concrete evidence. The British historian Roger E. Kirch, in his monumental work on human sleep patterns before the Industrial Revolution, documented something that completely shook the field of social history. For centuries, and in every culture he researched, human beings slept in two separate periods. The first sleep ran from nightfall until around midnight or 1 in the morning. Then there was a period of wakefulness lasting between 1 and 2 hours, and then a second sleep until dawn. This intermediate waking period was not treated as insomnia or a problem. It was the moment when people prayed, meditated, talked, reflected. It was considered the most intimate time of the day. What E. Kirch found is that this biphasic sleep pattern was the human norm for millennia. The idea that we should sleep 8 consecutive hours is a modern invention, tied to industrialization and artificial lighting. Before that, waking in the early morning was expected, natural, and spiritually cultivated. But the detail that very few people notice in E. Kirch's research is this. The timing of that natural awakening tended to concentrate between midnight and 3 in the morning. In other words, natural human biology, without the interference of alarms or artificial light, produced exactly the awakening that spiritual traditions identified as sacred. This is not metaphor. It is verifiable historical data. The convergence between the natural biological sleep pattern of human beings and what spiritual traditions identified as the hour of sacred vigil is one of the most solid pieces of evidence that something real and consistent happens in this window of time. But the evidence does not stop there. Let us move to the field of neuroscience. Researchers at Harvard University and other sleep research centers have mapped what happens in the human brain during so-called slow-wave sleep, the deepest sleep, and during the transitions to REM sleep in the final hours of the night. What they found is that between 2 and 4 in the morning, the human brain undergoes a process of emotional memory consolidation unlike any other phase of the cycle. This is the period in which traumatic experiences are reprocessed, in which connections between emotions and memories are formed or dissolved, and in which the limbic system operates in a mode of heightened sensitivity. In practical terms, this means that waking in this interval places you in a state in which your capacity for deep emotional processing is at its peak. Old fears may arise with greater intensity, but important intuitions do too. Clarity about relationships, decisions, and life direction, these perceptions tend to emerge with a force that rarely repeats itself during the day. Now connect this with what the Bible records. The Book of Job, considered by many scholars to be the oldest text in the biblical canon, is filled with references to spiritual visits and revelations that arrive in the early morning hours. In chapter 4, Eliphaz describes a nighttime vision. A spirit passed before my face. The hair of my body stood up. In chapter 33, Elihu declares, For God speaks in one way, and in two, though man does not perceive it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on men while they slumber on their beds, then he opens the ears of men. These texts are not describing random experiences. They are documenting a recognized and expected pattern of spiritual communication that takes place specifically during sleep and nighttime awakening. And there is a piece of evidence from the early church that is rarely mentioned in modern evangelical circles. The practice of the vigils, called vigiliae in Latin, was a central element of Christian liturgy in the first centuries. Christians gathered in the early morning hours, specifically between midnight and 3 in the morning, to pray, read the scriptures, and celebrate the Eucharist. This practice was not invented by medieval monks. It is documented in texts from the 2nd century, including the Didache and the writings of Pliny the Younger, who in a letter to Emperor Trajan describes Christians gathering before dawn to sing hymns to Christ. The question this raises is inevitable. If this pattern was so central to early Christian spiritual life, why did it disappear? Why does the modern church rarely mention the nightly vigil as a spiritual practice? And why has the spiritual significance of waking at 3 in the morning been so completely removed from popular religious language? If this has reached you, it was not by chance. Ignoring it is a choice, and every choice has consequences. The digital book is in the first pinned comment. Access it now. It may not be available tomorrow. Every video here is created with dedication to bring hope, spiritual direction, and biblical teaching to those who need it. If you believe in this mission, make a donation of any amount. Your support keeps this channel active and allows more lives to be reached. Link in the pinned comment. The answer to that question is uncomfortable, and it begins with a word that few within the church have the courage to say out loud. Control. Not control in any conspiratorial or sensationalist sense. Control in the historical, documented, and verifiable sense of how religious institutions over the centuries shaped and filtered what reached the average believer. To understand what was concealed or silenced about waking at 3 in the morning, you need to understand what happened to the Christian mystical tradition over the centuries. There are two types of spirituality that have coexisted within Christianity since its beginnings. There is institutional spirituality, liturgies, sacraments, doctrines, structures of authority. And there is experiential spirituality, the pursuit of direct experience of the sacred, of personal revelation, of intimate communication between the believer and God. These two traditions have always been in tension, and at certain historical moments, that tension turned into active suppression. The Christian mystics, John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, Marjorie Kempe, Julian of Norwich, and dozens of others, described with striking consistency spiritual experiences that happened specifically in the early morning, during the watch hour. They spoke of a luminous darkness, of a silence that speaks, of a presence that becomes perceptible exactly when the outside world ceases to produce noise. John of the Cross called this state Noche Oscura del Alma, the dark night of the soul. And what most people do not know is that the dark night is not a metaphor for generic spiritual suffering. It is a precise description of a state that literally occurs at night, during the vigil, when the believer remains awake and present while the whole world sleeps. These teachings were tolerated as long as they remained within monasteries and convents, accessible only to a literate spiritual elite. But when they began to spread, when figures like Meister Eckhart began preaching to laypeople in the vernacular language about direct experience of God in the early morning hours, the institutional reaction was immediate. Eckhart was investigated for heresy. His teachings were posthumously condemned by Pope John XII. Marjorie Kempe, who described revelations received during her nightly vigil, was repeatedly interrogated and threatened by ecclesiastical authority. Why? Because the teaching that any person, learned or not, rich or poor, consecrated or lay, could have direct access to the divine during the nightly watch, without priestly mediation, without sacraments, without institutional structure, was a threat to the centralized authority of the Church. If God speaks directly to the believer who wakes at 3 in the morning, what is the role of the intermediary? That question had political and economic answers that the institutions did not want the people to ask. And so gradually the practice of the nightly vigil was pushed to the margins. It survived within monastic orders, where it was controlled and ritualized, but it was removed from lay spirituality. The average believer was taught to sleep through the night and show up on Sunday morning. The idea that God might be communicating with them at 3 in the morning was replaced by the idea that divine communication necessarily passed through the approved institutional channels. This was not a uniform or necessarily conscious process on the part of all its agents, but the result is clear. Generations of Christians reached adulthood without any spiritual tools to interpret what happened when they woke in the early morning hours. Without language for this phenomenon, without practice to respond to it, many simply ignored it. Others felt fear. And that fear was frequently reinforced by a theology that identified all nighttime spiritual experience with demonic influence, without distinction, without the sophistication the fathers of the early church possessed. There is still an element of this history that remains almost completely unknown outside academic circles of religious history. During the medieval period, there existed in the Latin Church a liturgical practice called Vigiliae Nocturnae, the night vigils. It was a liturgical office that took place between midnight and 3 in the morning, composed of psalms, biblical readings, and prayers specific to that hour. This office explicitly acknowledged the special spiritual quality of the early morning hours and provided a spiritual framework for them. With the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, this and other elements of medieval liturgy were abandoned by much of the Christian world. The intention was legitimate, to simplify, to make accessible, to eliminate what seemed like superstition. But in the process, something real was lost along with what was truly superfluous. And the result, centuries later, is that most practicing Christians today have zero spiritual formation about what to do with waking at 3 in the morning. This digital book was not made for everyone. It was made for those who are ready to face the truth. Available for a limited time in the first pinned comment. If you hesitate, you may lose access. Now that you understand what was concealed and why, it is time to go even deeper. Because there is a philosophical and spiritual dimension to waking at 3 in the morning that transcends any specific religious tradition, and that connects the teaching of Jesus with something at the heart of all human wisdom about time, consciousness, and the sacred. Let us start with a question that seems simple but is deeply complex. What is the early morning from a philosophical standpoint? Not physically, not biologically, philosophically. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger, in his analysis of human existence, described moments he called Augenblick, the instant, the moment of clarity in which human beings confront their own existence in a raw way, without the distractions that daily life provides. Heidegger argued that these moments generally occur outside of ordinary routine, in situations of limit, of crisis, of radical silence. The early morning is exactly that. It is the chronological Augenblick. It is the moment when the world around you has stopped, when the noise of the day does not exist, when the future has not yet begun, and the past can no longer be remade. You are simply present. And in that radical presence, something emerges, something that philosophers call authenticity, and that the spiritual tradition calls an encounter with God. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, in his work on the I-Thou relationship, describes the genuine encounter with the sacred as something that cannot be produced, scheduled, or forced. It happens. And it happens most often in the moments when the eye has stopped being occupied with itself, in moments of stillness, of emptiness, of darkness. The early morning provides exactly these conditions. It is the hour when the ego, exhausted by the day, lets down its guard. And in that opening, the Thou, divine, sacred, transcendent, has room to manifest. This finds direct echo in the Gospels. Jesus, before every decisive moment of his ministry, sought out nighttime solitude to pray. Before choosing the 12 apostles, Luke records that he spent the entire night in prayer. Before his baptism, before the transfiguration, before the crucifixion, there is always a nightly vigil. This is not narrative coincidence. It is a pattern that Jesus himself established as a model, as an implicit instruction for his followers. The Buddhist tradition has a concept called Brahma Muhurta, which in Sanskrit means the hour of Brahma, the creator. It is the period that runs from an hour and a half before dawn until the sun rises. In that tradition, this is the most favorable time for meditation, spiritual study, and contemplative practice, because the mind is naturally quieter, more receptive, less conditioned by the inputs of the day. Tibetan monks, Sufi contemplatives, Jewish Kabbalists, Christian mystics, all independently arrived at the same conclusion about the spiritual value of the time before dawn. What this demonstrates is not that all religions are the same or that doctrinal distinctions do not matter. What it demonstrates is that there is an objective reality about this hour that different traditions, with different languages and different worldviews, all recognized and mapped. And when so many independent perspectives converge on the same point, that is a sign we are standing before something real. Within the specific Christian tradition, there is a teaching of Jesus that is rarely connected to the theme of nightly awakening, but which becomes extraordinarily relevant when you understand the context. In the Gospel of John, chapter 11, Jesus says, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks at night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him." Most interpretations treat this as a spiritual metaphor about acting according to God's light versus the darkness of sin, and it is that. But it is also a statement about the different nature of nighttime, about the fact that the night requires a different kind of orientation, an inner light that does not depend on the outward sun. The believer who wakes at 3 in the morning and remains present, conscious in prayer or contemplation is practicing exactly that, walking at night by the inner light, navigating the threshold with discernment, with faith, with openness to what the spiritual world has to offer at that specific moment. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, this is the moment. Press the button down here right now, because the next videos will go deeper into exactly what you are hearing now, and you will not want to miss that continuation. And I need to ask you something directly. After everything you have heard up to this point, do you still believe that your waking at 3 in the morning is merely biological, merely random, merely meaningless noise? Comment yes or no below, because your answer will tell me a great deal about where you are in your spiritual journey and will help me create content that speaks directly to what you need to hear right now. There is a moment when knowledge stops being merely information and begins to be a mirror. You look at what you have learned and suddenly you are no longer analyzing an external phenomenon, you are seeing yourself. You are recognizing something that was always present in your own experience, but that never had a name, never had context, never had the dignity of being taken seriously. I want you to pause for a moment, not metaphorically, literally. Take a breath. Because what you are about to hear is no longer history, no longer theology, no longer neuroscience. It is a direct conversation between what you have learned up to now and what you are going to do with it. Think about the last time you woke at 3 in the morning. What did you feel? Fear, restlessness, a sense of heaviness in your chest for no apparent reason, or perhaps the opposite, a strange clarity, a calm that made no sense given the hour, a sense that you were awake for a reason your rational mind could not articulate. Now think about what you did. You probably reached for your phone, checked the time, rolled over, tried to get back to sleep as quickly as possible, as if the awakening were an error to be corrected, a problem to be solved. And maybe you succeeded. But what if in that moment there was something waiting for you that you simply closed the door on? I am not saying this to blame you. I am saying it because it is exactly what the disciples did in Gethsemane, 3 times. And Jesus did not condemn them for it. He understood them. He said the spirit was willing but the flesh was weak. That is one of the most merciful phrases in the Gospels, and at the same time one of the most instructive. It acknowledges the real tension between what we are capable of perceiving spiritually and what our bodies, our fatigue, our biology pull us back to doing. It is not moral failure. It is the human condition. But the human condition can be worked with. It can be expanded. And that is exactly what the practice of the vigil proposes, not a supernatural overcoming of the need for rest, but a gradual cultivation of awareness that learns to recognize the nightly awakening as opportunity rather than inconvenience. Let me tell you about Anna the prophetess, described in the Gospel of Luke. She is mentioned briefly, almost in passing, but what Luke records about her is extraordinary. He says she never left the temple, serving God with fasting and prayer night and day. She was 84 years old. And it was she, not the priests, not the scribes, not the trained religious leaders, who recognized the infant Jesus when he was presented in the temple. She saw what the others did not. And the reason implied in the text is clear. She was awake when the others were asleep. Literally and spiritually. That is the transformation that knowledge about waking at 3 in the morning can work in you. It is not about losing sleep. It is not about becoming an ascetic or a monk. It is about developing a kind of attention, a quality of presence, that begins to recognize the sacred where before there was only background noise. The philosopher and theologian Paul Tillich described God not as a being among other beings, but as the ground of being, the deepest reality that sustains all existence. And he argued that this reality becomes perceptible not in moments of agitation and activity, but in moments of radical stillness, of real silence, of the shedding of the surface layers of daily life. The early morning is that shedding. It is the moment when the foundation appears because the constructions built upon it have temporarily given way. What this means for you is that every time you wake at 3 in the morning, you are being placed, by biology, by spirituality, by whatever you call the greater force, in direct contact with what Tillich would call the ground. With what Jesus called the Father. With what the Desert Fathers called the Presence. You can ignore it. You can roll over and go back to sleep. Or you can learn to remain present for a few minutes, open, quiet, receptive, and discover what is on the other side of that silence. What you are hearing is not common information. It is a truth that few have the courage to seek. The digital book is in the first pinned comment. Click now. It could come down at any moment. So what do you actually do when you wake at 3 in the morning? That is the question that transforms knowledge into practice, theory into life. And the answer is not complicated, but it requires you to undo a deep conditioning, the belief that waking in the middle of the night is a problem. The first step is simple and radical at the same time. Do not reach for your phone. This goes against everything your body will want to do. The impulse to grab the phone, check notifications, look at the exact time, it is a flight mechanism from the present experience. The phone immediately pulls you out of the state of spiritual permeability that the nightly awakening creates and throws you back onto the surface of daily life. You cannot be at the threshold and in the news feed at the same time. The second step is to be still for a few moments before deciding anything. 10 breaths, 20. Just sit with the experience of being awake at that hour. Notice what is present, physical sensations, emotions, thoughts that arise, images that appear in the mind. Do not judge. Do not analyze yet. Just observe. This state of quiet observation is what the contemplative tradition calls readiness for prayer, not the verbal prayer yet, but the openness that precedes and makes it possible. The third step is to ask, not necessarily out loud, but with clear and conscious intention. Why am I awake? What needs attention right now? This question is not superstitious. It is a practical application of spiritual discernment, the capacity to distinguish between internal noise and a legitimate signal, between anxiety and intuition, between fear and a real warning. Many people who have adopted this practice report concrete, verifiable results. Concerns about specific people that arose during the nightly vigil and that the following day proved relevant. The person was going through something difficult at that very moment. Clarity about decisions that seemed impossible during the day but that at 3 in the morning, in the silence, began to reveal a path forward. Feelings of deep peace that came during nighttime prayer and remained throughout the following day in a way that ordinary physical rest rarely produces. This is not magic. It is not irresponsible mysticism. It is the functioning of spiritual discernment under conditions that favor its silence, stillness, openness, availability. And it is exactly what Jesus practiced. What the apostles were called to practice in Gethsemane and could not. What the Desert Fathers systematized. What the Christian mystics mapped in impressive detail. And what modernity has almost completely swallowed. The fourth step is not to fight sleep if it returns. The practice of the vigil is not about forcing the state of consciousness. It is about remaining present while the state is naturally available. If after 10, 15, 20 minutes of stillness and prayer you feel sleep returning, let it. You did what the moment called for. You were spiritually awake as long as it was possible. That is enough. It is far more than most people do. The fifth step, and perhaps the most transformative of all, is to begin keeping a record of these vigils. A simple notebook beside the bed. Not an elaborate spiritual journal, just brief notes about what arose, what you felt, what you prayed, what you perceived. Over weeks and months, this record will begin to reveal patterns. It will show the areas of your life that the spiritual world has been trying to bring to your attention repeatedly. It will show connections between your awakenings and events in your life and in the lives of those around you that you would never have noticed without the record. This is applied spirituality, not theory. It is practice. It is the kind of practice that transforms not only how you live your late nights, but how you experience your faith, your prayer, your relationship with God at every moment of the day. The Bible says in Psalm 127 verse 2, "He grants sleep to those he loves." This verse is frequently cited to justify rest, and that is legitimate. But there is another possible reading, one that contemplatives have made throughout the centuries. God also withholds sleep from his beloved when there is something important that needs to be communicated, perceived, prayed. The same God who gives rest is the God who interrupts rest when the eternal needs to speak to the temporal. You are on that list. Not by merit, not by spiritual expertise, not by religious position. Simply by the fact of being awake when you should be sleeping, listening when you could be ignoring, seeking when it would be easier to close your eyes. Every day we receive messages from people who found comfort, hope, and strength through this channel. And that is only possible because there is a community that believes in this mission. If you feel that this content has made a difference in your life and you wish to help us continue bringing this message to more people, I left a support link in the first pinned comment. Your contribution helps us keep this work active and reach even more families, homes, and hearts. If you decide to support, know that your help is part of this mission. Thank you for walking with us. Throughout this video, you have traveled through a great deal. You understood how the ancient watch system shapes the way the Gospels describe spiritual time. You saw how Jesus chose the fourth watch, exactly the period between 3 and 6 in the morning, to manifest to his disciples by walking on water. You understood what happened in Gethsemane and why the call to watch was not a request for emotional companionship, but a spiritual instruction with real consequences. You discovered the historical and scientific evidence that converges to show that this hour is objectively different in terms of spiritual permeability. You learned what was silenced and why. You received the tools to transform your next waking at 3 in the morning into an encounter with the sacred rather than a nightly inconvenience. This is not information that everyone has. It is knowledge that most people will carry to their graves without ever reaching. And the fact that you stayed here until the end says something about who you are. Thousands of people have already accessed the digital book and said they never looked at this subject the same way again. The link is in the first pinned comment. You decide whether you want to be part of that group. You who made it this far are already different. Most people quit in the first few minutes, and you stayed. That is not small. If this video opened something in you, if it gave you language for something you always felt but never knew how to name, hit the like button now. Every like helps this content reach more people who need to hear exactly this. Subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell, because what is coming is directly connected to what you just learned, and you will not want to miss it. And those who made it to the end should comment the phrase "I am awake" below. I want to see the warriors who stayed until the end, those who understood that waking at 3 in the morning was never a problem, it was always a calling. And check out the video appearing on screen right now. It is the natural next step to everything you heard today. Do not close the page before clicking on it.